Hello and welcome again to Mind Science TV. We've got another fantastic program for you today. I'm bringing to you someone that I've been reading for years and been a great admirer of, and I'm so pleased to have the conversation. John Arden. And for any of you out there who don't know John Arden, you will in the next 45 minutes, and then you're going to rush out and get all these books, and then you'll know a lot more. So let's start off by just saying hello, John Arden.
Hi, Richard. Great to be here.
And how are you today? We can't say this morning or this afternoon because there's different time frames everywhere, but how are you at this time?
Oh, I'm doing great. Had a great lunch earlier and walked around. It's misty here in Northern California, and happy to talk to you down there in Sydney.
That's lovely. Now, I'm going to make you sit there and look terribly humble for a minute or two because I just want to continue telling people how wonderful you are. So sorry about that, or hooray for that. But so folks, John Arden is a practicing psychologist and psychotherapist, particularly in the USA. He's set in San Francisco, and he not only works for, but actually is, let me read my notes here, the training director for mental health at one of the world's most respected HMOs in America. Huge. He has over 100 interns at any given time, over 22 or more centers. He has about 300 or 400 practitioners that he cares for and looks after and supervises. And he's got 12 books under his belt. We'll show a few of them as we go along. I've just got this one that is one of my Bibles, Brain-Based Therapy for Adults. He's got one for teenagers. We'll talk about some more of them as we go along. He's got another book coming up, which hopefully he'll tell us about in a minute. And in between all that, dear John has found a moment or two to have a chat with us. So now let's get on with our conversation. Oh yes, by the way, folks, you should know by now I'm Richard Hill, so from Sydney, Australia. So here we go. Now, welcome, John. This is, as I say, a great privilege for me to have you here. Brain-based therapy. It sounds to some people, and I know this, and this is what the Mind Science Institute's all about. It has a tendency to sound scary. Oh my God, brain-based, the brain, it's so complicated. So well, how can I ever, oh, and then they all run away and hide in a bucket or have to go and get therapy. But just give us a little bit of your sort of reflection over the years of doing this thing of brain-based therapy.
Well, first of all, let me say that the title, brain-based therapy, unfortunately sounds rather reductionistic, and the intent is not to be reductionistic. And in fact, the intent is to be integrative. So let me tell you about the concerns that have been welling up in me over the last number of years. You mentioned that I'm involved in this very large training program in Northern California. And we also have a whole lot of graduate schools in Northern California. In fact, they're just pumping out all these people with fancy graduate degrees, you know, masters and PhDs and so on. And I'm literally talking about hundreds of people being pumped out of these professional and academic institutions. And over the years, I have become rather concerned about the over-compartmentalization of the psychotherapy world. Earlier, before we started, you and I were talking about the clubhouses. And I feel strongly that these clubhouses unfortunately have siloed people in their respective camps. You can be a level 4 EMDR person, and I was mentioning earlier that I was talking to a friend over in the EFT camp earlier at lunch, and then there's the CBT, and there's many different versions of psychodynamic, and they often have their own little language system, and very rarely do they talk with other people from the other camps. Well, think of what the poor clients are going through. You know, when they go from one camp to another, and this therapist talked about integrated, you know, interjected self-objects, and the other guy was talking about exposure paradigms, and God, what is he talking about? You know, people get confused. And I think that one of the major reasons why all those camps develop was that we had no common basis for any common denominators to develop, and I call that the Cartesian era, roughly between 1890 and about 1980, whereby we didn't know much about the brain. So there was a plethora of schools out there, from primal scream to radical behaviorism, and little dialogue between them. And then around 1980, you had this convergence of a number of factors that got us all on the same page. It was actually a very positive development, but it created a one-dimensional psychotherapy world, and we call that the Pax Medica phase. And it's a play on words, of course, because Pax Romana was the term often now used to talk about the Roman world roughly 2,000 years ago, when you could travel anywhere in the Roman world as long as you didn't insult Roman gods or Roman law, you were cool, as long as you know who was on top. Well, similarly, when Pax Medica emerged, the medical model was on top, and as long as you know who's in charge here, and medication and psychiatry and all that, all you people doing all this psychotherapy stuff out there, you do supportive therapy, but you know what the real heart of the matter is. So psychotherapists started calling themselves clinicians, and sometimes when they're talking in these so-called treatment meetings, they would go, well, clinically speaking, well, what were they talking about a few minutes ago? Now they're talking clinicalese or something, and or what's medically necessary here? Well, as you can see, it brought everybody to the same page, and the page really was related to the books of bad names. DSM-3 came out in 1980. It was much better than DSM-2, but as my friend Lou Cozzolino refers to it, it gave us the hardening of the categories. And unfortunately, people really thought of these disorders as discrete entities, almost like genetic tracks that a person is on. And I think we're ready to emerge from Pax Medica, and we have the opportunity for a much better and more comprehensive integrated model that includes many of the developmental theories and memory research and psychodynamic theory, CBT, and integrate it all with and get rid of all the extra baggage, all the kind of jingoistic terms that we use to over-define our little clubhouse.
It's almost like we went into a socio-political defining of our
Yes.
product, which is okay, but for a brief period of time. And I know exactly what you mean. I mean, one of the necessities in order to be able to establish the validity and the veracity of a technique was that you had to manualize it in order to be able to research it, because you couldn't just sort of say, oh yeah, we're just winging it and seeing what happens, because I mean, I appreciate that research has to be pretty well founded, but once you've manualized something, and you may have taken several years to do so, wow, you need to get a little bit of return for your time, and you can't sort of sit there and say, well, just take my manual and 6 or 7 other manuals and just mix them up at your own. Yeah, just do it how you feel like it. But of course, that's exactly what Erickson said to us. And I'm sort of quite fascinated by Erickson. So Erickson just sort of said, the client will tell you what their therapy is, because they're actually practicing the therapy that's best of it. The trouble is they're just practicing it badly, and they need some help.
Very true. Very true. The manualized approach, you could say, was part of not only the Cartesian era with all the different little groups and all that, but later became part of the science of Pax Medica, and we could call that evidence-based practice. And that was a good development, I think. We know that, sitting around talking about somebody's relationship with their mother when they were 3 with somebody with a panic disorder may not really help that much. Interceptive exposure seems to be much more effective, but that manualized approach without a more robust integrated model is that one dimensionality that we're ready to leave.
Yeah, yeah, I think so. I mean, I'll be talking to another friend of mine, Terry Marks Tarlow, and she's just written a book on intuition in therapy. It's really beautifully written. That'll come out. I think it's just out somewhere now. But this idea that therapy is an interactive and interpersonal process, and that knowledge is actually something that is foundational. So going back to what we were saying before, when I hear and read your book cover brain-based therapy, I see that as a not so much as a dominating determination statement, but as we're utilizing brain-based stuff here. Cool. How beautiful. When I'm doing whatever it is I'm doing, I'm utilizing that information. And I think it was really was something, I think it was an off-the-cuff comment of Steven Pinker's when someone was talking to him about counterintuitive behavior, sort of, because I know in therapy we can't just guess, but he said counterintuitive stuff, he said, interestingly, the more I know, the less counterintuitive my thoughts become. And I think this is very important. So we need to know a lot, and we need to know more, but we need to, like a piano player, you need to know the technique, but then you need to allow yourself to improvise.
Oh yeah, you need that kind of flexibility. And without that flexibility, then who you're talking to? Some automaton? You're talking to somebody with a great degree of different expressions of affect, and they come from a different experience base than you do. And being too manualized and too stuck in what you've already known, then of course leaves the other person out of the picture. It kind of thinks of them as some computer program or something.
I wonder if it might be opportune just at this point, if we could just discuss grabbing this wonderful book, plug number 37, which it needs and warrants. But I just made some marks of some of the interesting things you've got in here, because of course what's good about this book is it's not just academic carry on, it's description of what's going on, and regularly interspersed with actual clinical, well, we've just had clinicians, but in-room sort of therapy work. And there's this lovely one about Beth, who came in. She had terrible troubles with her father. It didn't take long to figure out that her relationship with her father was pretty poor. He was, as I think you describe it in there, he was a bastard, which in Australian vernacular makes it very clear. And the young therapist who was looking at it was what so many of us do, was sitting there and saying, well, we need to work with this trauma she's having with her father. We need to help her understand and deal with this issue with the father. But when he sought some supervision in your group, his supervisor said, no, just a minute, let's have a look at what the brain's telling us, what the behavior is telling us about what the brain needs. And I wonder if you can go on a little bit more and just extend a bit more, because I just found it a really great example of how a brain-aware sort of therapist can choose a better therapy.
We were actually, before we started the interview, talking a little bit about this, and you made mention of the concept of the base as a mnemonic to remember when you're talking to a client. So with this Beth person that you're mentioning, I think it's important to think in terms of those different dimensions, so you're not just stuck in the brain dynamics. So the B of the mnemonic is for brain, but the A is for the alliance, and the alliance can have a lot to do with the attachment relationships that now are played through different adult relationships that she now has. And the S in the base is for the system of psychological theories, which include maybe the diagnostic, the book of bad names, and all that. And then if there's an evidence-based practice, the E, and I underline if there's an evidence-based practice, because not always is there evidence-based practice, if she's not having panic disorder or phobias or whatever. But frankly, I don't remember Beth, but let me just hypothesize and maybe sort of bring the concept of Beth alive by talking about maybe her attachment relationship with her parents early on, and maybe perhaps even her father was very toxic to her and made it more difficult for her to interact with others with a feeling of wholeness and self-respect and all that, which might have developed in her a tendency to be more passive withdrawal. And that passive withdrawal, from the B perspective in base, would be much more of a right frontal as opposed to left frontal activation, because we know that when the right frontal lobe is activated a whole lot, we have a tendency not only to see big pictures and all that, and certainly more negative emotions than positive emotions on the left, but also withdrawal and avoidance. So perhaps Beth then, as a result of being around this toxic family system, withdrew and became more passive as a defense to survive in that family. And unfortunately, what we also know that unfortunately plays out in maybe Beth's life is that passive withdrawals and overactive right prefrontal cortex has a tendency to kindle anxiety. And we know that thanks to some great work at University of Wisconsin, Richard Davidson and others have found that overactive right prefrontal cortex are indicative of anxiety, and underactive left being more indicative of depression. So here we have, as a result perhaps of this not so warm and loving family environment, a person that might have adapted by becoming more avoidant and withdrawal when she interacts in, let's say, stressful interpersonal situations. And that then kindles up a depressive cycle and has a tendency to perhaps not regulate her affect very well, because it seems that the left prefrontal is better at controlling or regulating affect than the right prefrontal is. So she might have a little bit more of an activated amygdala, hyperactive amygdala. So here we have all these dimensions, the brain dynamics, the attachment alliance that might have something to do with my interaction and my attempt to develop a good therapeutic relationship with her, because she might then withdraw and be a little bit more avoidant to various dynamics in our communication, and then understanding how those memory systems work, which I think is really a major foundation to any therapeutic encounter in terms of long-term efficacy, in terms of what we're doing and all that, which is part of the S, we'd say. And then let's say that she's got an anxiety disorder. I want to think in terms of whether or not there is a evidence-based practice. In this case, we could say that exposure is a good idea. Withdrawal and avoidance, not so good idea. In fact, that would contribute to more anxiety.
And you know, I mean, you wrote this book some years ago, so that's not a current that's not a current case in your thinking, but you're still able to, based on just a couple of simple aspects from using the brain as your understanding of the brain, you're able to wax lyrical for, you know, beautiful 3 or 4 minutes there, you know, because one of the things certainly that I've found as I work, and I've had a couple of clients with this sort of early trauma stuff, that it's actually not the trauma that that's the issue. And I think this is the case with Beth and what you're talking about there. With the avoidance, when they avoid, that means they don't, they're not allowing brain activity, they're not allowing brain development. And so what actually is exactly as you say, because of avoidance, instead of developing her regulating processes from the sort of left prefrontal cortex, they're undeveloped. But actually her trauma ones are highly developed. So rather than trying to make her do something to her trauma context, it's actually doing something to her regulating context. I mentioned this with Bonnie Badnock. I mean, I just had this unbelievably classic case where her avoidance mechanism meant she didn't develop her theory of mind extensively. And so she just, in the way she coped with her father, who was and mother to an extent, but father definitely, she just didn't think about what he thought. So at 30, she didn't know how to think about what other people thought. So I'm going, wow, this is temporal parietal junction stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. Then go off and do my research. And from the brain base, exactly as you say, then come out with lots of effective therapies. And interestingly enough, the therapy that we actually utilized was art therapy, which I'd never done before ever.
That's an area my wife was sort of into some years ago. And I used to employ art therapists in my day treatment programs back in the 80s, and a great avenue to get at that. I understand that Bonnie's sort of interested in that.
She does that a lot, yeah. But what I found was that my client was very good at art therapy. I just helped.
Very good.
So that was curious. Because when I say art therapy, she spontaneously brought drawings and pictures and paintings and things. That's actually what I mean by it, which is a really curious thing. But that sort of actually takes me to another really good bit in your book. There were two there, but one particularly was talking about. Oh, John, yes.
I just wanted to give credit to my co-author, who's a very close friend of mine, Lloyd Linford. So when you say my book, I want to make sure that people know that it's not just my book, but my very good friend Lloyd Linford, who's this very wise and gentle, warm human being, and what a great writer he is. He's a better writer than I am.
Oh, that's kind, and I do. You're quite right. In doing that, in fact, it's an expression of your good character. I mean, it really is something about. Not everybody would have mentioned that. Yeah. We won't talk about that. But moving on, just going, because I was going to say, when you're talking about therapy, there's and in the Brainbased Therapy book, and there's a lot of conversation about it at the moment. What makes for good therapy? Is it the practice, the technique? Meaning a therapist generated thing, which we've actually been discussing that maybe that's not so much the case. Is it client-based, where is it strictly this sort of, was Erickson saying that's the only way, and I don't think he was, that you just do what the client does. But then also the other one, which is hugely talked about at the moment, Scott Miller's doing a lot of work on this at the moment, in the relationship between the therapist and the client. And there's a bit of discussion, do a nice chapter of discussion here of I think very prescient to what's going on at the moment in relation to what makes an excellent piece of therapy.
I think that Scott Miller and John Norcross and Michael Lambert and that group of outcome management researchers have really helped us a great deal understand the multiple textures of these therapeutic relationships, so much so that we've invited all three to our system to help us develop a much better and robust outcome management program. Now we even have a chief of outcome management within our system. And we're finding out, well, they are actually finding out all sorts of pretty amazing things about how little we know about what goes on in a therapeutic encounter, such as, for example, many of us are such poor judges of what's happening in a therapeutic encounter or a series of therapeutic encounters, and that 80% of us think we're better than average. And the math isn't very good there, right? And it turns out that according to some research, that those people that think they're better than average are the ones that are worse than average, based on the client report and all that. I like to talk about how before we started to include these outcome reports, giving a client a questionnaire right after the session and then them giving you feedback, not in the session, but afterwards, that we would do these member patient satisfaction reports. So let's say they go up, they see me, and they get something in the mail to measure through a questionnaire, how did you this guy, Dr. Arden, approach your problems, and were you satisfied, and everything else. And we would call those the MPS scores. And my job, some years ago, back in the 90s, when I was the chief psychologist at this very large medical center in Vallejo, I would have these, I would have to sit down with a psychologist because I was the supervisor of all the psychologists, and we had, I don't know, about 25 of them, and then I was a supervisor of another 10. So I'd have to sit down with these people, and some of them would have bad MPS scores. And but interestingly, those people that had the bad MPS scores thought they were better than average. And one of the people that I sat down with that would always get really bad MPS scores, when I said, well, geez, let's use the word Barbara. Barbara, if maybe we could work together, and I could maybe give you some suggestions about how we might improve this area. And she says, well, I know I see these scores and everything, but it's just not how I see things. Well, that's the point. The client sees them differently. So you can see this big gap between, and she thought she was just so much better than average. I mean, she was on top of everything. And anyway, I think this new effort to take a look at the other side of the evidence-based practice group is the outcome management. And these psychotherapy research conferences have pretty healthy discussions about what is going on in therapy from these different angles.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I thought that the encouraging thing of some of the statistics that Scott was doing, particularly in that thing of therapists, their opinion of themselves, that even when you look at the overall statistic, there was sort of 80%, but what it tended to be was that those that overestimated themselves always overestimated themselves. Those that estimated themselves well always estimated themselves well, and those that underestimated tend to always underestimate. So it wasn't that 80% of therapists get it wrong. Sort of there's a percentage that get it 100% right. And then there's a percentage. So if we just do some work to help those that are showing these lower scores, then that'll improve. But I just taking it to the average guy out there. I mean, we've got MPSS scores and forms and hassling things. Is it just as effective, really, for the therapist to be saying to their client that type of thing of how's it going?
Oh, sure. I think that's been part of our lore all along. But I'm wondering, and as I heard from when we brought some of these figures in, say Michael Lambert, for example, that oftentimes a client is less comfortable saying how it's going, and maybe a little bit more comfortable when it's a little bit more anonymous. So like we all want to make the person sitting in the room with us to feel okay, and we don't want to upset them or humiliate them, most of us. When somebody says, how's it going? Oh, okay, yeah, as opposed to, well, you know what, you said something last week that really bothered me, and I don't know where you're coming off, and you didn't even get my mother's name right, and I'm always chronically messing up people's names. But instead of being able to do that, sometimes people are less comfortable coming out with that. Certainly, if they can, boy, you can make a lot of headway. And I really love Winnicott's concept of good enough mothering, borrowing that to talk about good enough therapy. We're all imperfect, and it's how we repair the impingements, how we repair those misunderstandings and all that really builds a relationship, instead of us pumping ourselves up and becoming these omnipotent, all-knowing therapists. Rather, we don't really know what's exactly going on in our clients' world, and we're in a constant process of discovering that, maybe after months.
But I think this is so true. The very much looking at the flow, the ebb and flow of your relationship with your client is a part of what actually can inspire you to understand what area of development needs to be going on, particularly if you're going down one path and there just seems to be this discomfort in the relationship. That's a great way of letting you know. Just like in any relationship.
Sure.
If you keep bringing your wife flowers and she keeps throwing them out, well, maybe there's something else you need to be attending to.
Or
but I know with Michael,
what if she says, "Oh, those are pretty flowers," and then rolls her eyes, and you don't even know that she's rolling her eyes? Then it's a little bit more problematic.
And I think Michael Lambert's stuff. I know Michael was doing a talk and I was listening with great fascination to what he was saying, and I began to hear the grumbles around me from therapists, and that feeling of well, that's not going to tell them about me. Well, my theory, the winner-loser world theory. No one wants to be wrong. There's this huge pressure to be not wrong. Yeah. So this is really interesting. This for you. You really do not only see your own practice, but you see this overall practice. So this is a big insight that you get.
Yeah, and the other part of it, in addition to that messiness, is how much. God, how can I say it in a tactful way? But I think we think too much of ourselves as all. I hear so many people talking about, well, when I was in training, and as if they got all this incredible depth and everything, and now they're this all-knowing person, and I got to say that my adolescent hero was Socrates, and he was fond of talking about how ignorant he was, I guess you could say, in a more metaphorical way, and that he was constantly in this process of discovering, and I really think that though we are talking about this major sea change occurring in the mental health world, this integrative model moving away from Pax Medica and all that, I am convinced that in 5 years, I'll be looking back at what I thought and maybe even what I wrote about. I might scratch my head and go, God, what was I thinking? God, what a primitive understanding of what, because, the next generation, I really feel is, boy, it's an exciting time to get into this field. I believe the economy, though, unfortunately, in mental health is not so good, and there's going to be a lot of people not going into it because of their concern about not making an adequate living and all that. But in terms of the discovery, boy, what an exciting period! Because what we know now is just so primitive. But God, it's so much better than what we knew before.
Yes, I think it's primitive, but I think it's well founded.
Yes,
it's not sort of. I don't think we're back at the sort of like the physicians in the medieval era saying how wonderful bleeding people to remove their humours. I think we're on a sort of a correct path, but it's early days, and I think what is interesting and hopefully is exciting for me with the Mind Science Institute is that although you're used to talking to Americans and American psychotherapists, as we're doing this here, you're also talking to people now in Singapore and India and Japan, and we've got some people in Europe, some in Norway. We've got a couple of people from Afghanistan. I know we've got at least one fellow from Morocco.
Great.
And this is a whole new area of therapeutic development, which is moving, which is utilizing the Western models and massaging them into something that is culturally specific and new. And I think this is kind of what we're talking about, even in Western stuff. We've got it to a point. Now let's start to keep it pliable, keep it plastic.
I'm really glad that you're bringing up this international dimension here, and I'm very fortunate to speak at the International Congress of Psychology in Cape Town coming up this summer. And the title of the talk, the subtitle from Brain-Based Therapy, the subtitle is a cross-cultural and common denominator among among theoretical schools. So it's this, it's not one size fits all, but I think this next era will factor in many dimensions that go beyond the boundaries of our culture. And for example, I really love Paul Ekman's work on facial expressions, and he's done a tremendous amount of research across the globe. Way back in the mid-'60s, finding these small villages in New Guinea that didn't have much contact with Westerners at all, to try to see if there is any common emotional expression through the face. I think this new era can help us take a look at some of the common factors, and then you have superimposed upon those common factors all the cultural factors and the individualistic factors that are always at play. It's not like you and I are the same just because we have a human brain, but there are some common denominators among us because we have a human brain. And then you superimpose all these other layers, the culture and the families and everything else.
Well, the wonderful thing is a two-way street. The biology and the brain create the mind, but the mind also goes back and affects the biology and the neuroscience. And the pathway to get to various areas of brain development varies, and that's what we need to understand as therapists. But the orbito-prefrontal cortex will always be the place for error detection. And the basal ganglia will always be the area that has automatic thoughts and movements, and the amygdala will always be the area that holds these fearful things. It's just the nature of the way in which it gets there can be very different, and utilize different parts of the brain. There's a beautiful slide I've got of a Western mathematician and a Chinese mathematician. And the two brains are all, the fMRI, they're almost completely different. There's some common areas, but what they're basically saying is that a Chinese mathematician arrives at the answer in an entirely different utilization of brain processing than the Western one.
Rich,
and it's just,
if you don't
terrific.
mind, can you send me that image? I would love to get that image.
Yeah, I've got it around somewhere.
I would love to show that as part of my presentations. That'd be great. I'd love to have that.
Well, I think there's also something we were saying before, which is good for the people listening to actually bring to the fore, and it's a huge part of the Mind Science Institute's philosophy. Is we were chatting about things, and you were saying to me, "Oh, Richard, that's great. Could you send me that?" And then you're talking about your new book. I'm saying, you send me that, and this idea that practitioners, researchers, thinkers should share their stuff. I think it's actually a novel idea.
Oh yeah, that's the next era. We as we were talking about earlier, we don't need any more gurus and heads of schools and all that. It's much more integrated. I mean, think of the metaphor of the internet, for that matter. I mean, look at, we're doing this interview and you're thousands of miles away from me. The sharing of information is so much more accessible to us now. And before we had, let me even say that, to some degree, Europe and then the United States seemed to be, the places where people would go for this information and all that. And I'd like to say to you that in my two previous tours of speaking down in Australia, I learned that down under actually means deeper.
That's lovely.
Because
Thank you.
I was really astounded by the sophistication and the reading that people are doing in wide numbers of fields. So the people that came to my seminars, boy, they were pretty darn astute. And I learned a lot from some of the people that came up during the breaks and all that to share information about some of the areas that I was talking about that I knew nothing about. And so it was great going down there.
Well, I think that that's the true measure of an expert is someone who knows they don't know stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
But having said that, I just want to make now a mention of the fact that you're coming back to Australia again. I know you were here last year, which is really cool, but you're coming back again towards the end of this year. I think it's towards the end of October.
Right.
And for all the Australian listeners, and for anybody who around the world who might be coming to Australia around that time, it's with the STARTS group. That's STTARTS. Just Google it. It's a trauma therapy group. They're really do fantastic work, and they bring out some great speakers. So John will be speaking with them there, and I think you're speaking about a child or adolescent based trauma.
Well,
I can't
I
remember.
think, well, the talk is going to be on trauma in general. Uh,
Trauma
yeah,
in general,
and
right?
from a brain-based perspective, integrating all these dimensions that we've been talking about, memory and attachment and all of that in both Sydney and Adelaide. And then I'm going to go over to Auckland afterwards.
What are you working on at the moment? I know you've got another book and some other things coming out in imminently.
Well,
Imminently, you're penning final words. Let us know about those.
well, I have a deadline to finish a book called Sharpen Your Brain, which is about how to keep your brain healthy in our later years. You know, how there's this amazing, I guess you could say, pivotal point during middle age, and what you do during this period has a big effect on how healthy your brain is going to be later on. So I've been going back and forth between the professional writing area and then the trade press, in part because you know, not everybody reads these professional books, and I feel that if you can communicate to a larger audience and make things about what we've been talking about more accessible to people that aren't professionally trained, they can really gain from it. And in fact, my wife was joking with me the other day that when I was offered to write one of those dummies book, I kind of cringed. This is about 10 years ago. And a dummies book. I wrote America's Meltdown, you know, about the dumbing down of America. I don't want to write a dummies book. Well, by the way, they search out dummies to write them, and that's why they found me. Uh, so, but she made a really good point. She said, well, are you trying to help people or not? I mean, and who are you going to help? Are you just going to help this little section of professionals or help a wider audience? And it was a great exercise. It really was. And now I'm compelled to make what I'm trying to convey and the discoveries that we're making together with my clients memorable, so they can put to use that material. So, you know, I'm always talking about the brain with my clients now. And I'm doing it in such a way that hopefully they'll remember how to use this information to make better use of the techniques that we come up with. You know, for example, you know, we know that in the CBT world, there's a lot of techniques that are prescribed, but very little explanation as to why. So I really think that explaining why a person might be phobic or anxious or depressed or whatever, from a brain-based perspective, can make it a little bit more tangible. And if they can also understand the amazing power of neuroplasticity, how neuroplasticity occurs, and how you really need a moderate degree of activation to create neuroplastic change, meaning in a sense you need to get a moderate degree of anxiety. In other words, you got to step out of your comfort zone. You know, as Fritz Perls used to say way back, it was in that 1951 book, that initial Gestalt therapy book, The Safe Emergency, that we need to help a person have that safe emergency, meaning you get the nice support behind them and they feel, you know, supported, but at the same time you're pushing that person to get out of their comfort zone, and that's where the neuroplastic change takes place anyway. So when a client says to me that, well, you know, John, I know what you're saying I ought to do, but, you know, I'm not quite ready for it because I'm still a little anxious. And I say, why lose the opportunity? You're still a little anxious. Let's not wait until you're totally comfortable with the idea. Let's make some brain change here, neuroplastic brain change. And I just say rewire your brain. I don't use the word neuroplasticity. Because people aren't going to remember that. Or I don't even use the word amygdala often. I just call it Amy. And it's easier to think in terms of taming Amy than it is to tame the amygdala. So people remember those kinds of ways of conceptualizing what to do, what the brain's doing and all that, as opposed to coming up with these big flashy terms and everything else.
Well, I think it's so true. It's to give them some confidence. You say go into the get out of your comfort zone. You know, go into this space between the known and the unknown. And if there's just this feeling I find not with everybody. Some people it actually makes them feel more uncomfortable, and that's fair enough because they don't like all the technicalities. But this I feel it's like a safety line. It's like there's a wire between the two zones, and there's just this you've got this safety line that if you fall off doing your bit of CBT, if that's what it is, or fall off doing the whatever therapeutic practice, you can sit there and say, oh, my brain hasn't quite got it yet. But if I do it again, I know, because I know that brain, and of course, just talk about brain plasticity, this follow-up to sharpen your brain is to the other terrific book you've done is Rewire the Brain. So that was only a year or so ago. So people, again, get out there and look it up. I've actually haven't got it here. I've got it in the office. So so all this stuff, and I think unfortunately, I just look at the clock. We've got to wind up now, or otherwise people, because I know a lot of people listen to these during their lunch hour, which is really nice. So we've been in between peanut butter sandwiches and coffee, but if we wind it up now, I think it's a good point to wind it up. That with the use of the knowledge of the brain, which is the organ we treat, as well as the rest of the body, and in the Mind Science Institute talks, we'll be hearing a lot about the rest of the body. We're not just sticking with the neurons. That you can actually provide confidence for your client, confidence for yourself, and perhaps a greater capacity to get a more accurate idea of the success or the benefit of the therapy you're doing. And I think this is part of the enormous contribution that you've certainly made over the last 10 or 15 years with these wonderful books.
Well, as you said before, we're all in this, and that is an amazing collaborative effort. And interestingly, and I would rather I should say importantly, people out there that are coming to us are reading Newsweek, Time Magazine, whatever, New York Times, Australian Times articles about the brain. And if they go in to their therapist and they say, hey, I heard of this, I read this stuff about neuroplasticity. Do you know anything about that? And if their therapist says, yeah, I don't know, I'm into psychotherapy, not that, I don't know what's going on. You need to be ahead of the learning curve there and make use of that information to help motivate people and help them learn how to make effective changes in their lives. And so this material, since this material is out there, not only should we know about it, but we also ought to make use of it.
I think so. I was in the art gallery there. That they've got a new art gallery or an old art gallery that's been renovated, and there were two of the guides or the caretaker girls were there, the young girls, and they were talking about some brain stuff, and it was all wrong. So I just sort of stepped over and I said, "Oh, look, pardon me, but I'm into neuroscience, and but perhaps you could get some guidance." They were fascinated. Their eyes were wide open, and I explained the things and clarified the stuff they were on about. And she said, "Oh, could you come in every day?" I think our clients, by and large, and certainly those that want it, they need to want it. I think they're ready to know more than just go out and do this, trust me.
Yeah, exactly. That trust me part, there's this big gap, and they want to know why. Most people want to know why. Wouldn't you want to know why? I'd want to know why.
Well, that's why I ended up here.
Right.
All right, John, it's a great night. Do we want to know why? That's the question that John and I leave. And now I'll talk to you again directly, everybody. This is what we leave you with. Do you want to know why? And I suspect that because you're listening to this show, you do. And do you have friends who want to know why. Well, send them a link to this episode, this program of Mind Science TV. It's free for everybody. This is my gift and wonderful people like John's gift to you guys. But for now, we want to give you the introduction and the insight through these wonderful free opportunities, and Mind Science TV is just another one of those. And I just have to say to you, John, thank you so much for giving your time. And we hope you can come and join us again sometime.
Oh, well, thank you. Great conversation. I really enjoyed it.